Ah, the French.
Idle thrust. It's idle, and, to a lesser extent, it is thrust. Described by myself as the thrust generated by an aircraft's engine at its lowest operating steady-state setting, usually in RPM, it is also described in many real-world aircraft operating manuals that the given aircraft can be taxied rather easily using just this idle thrust. Likewise, there are many Flight Sim 2004 and Flight Sim X jet airliners that can be taxied at idle thrust. The iFly 737 and 747, the Level D 767, the Captain Sim and Quality Wing 757s, the Wilco Airbus series, so on and so forth. But in the same simulators, all of the included default jet airliners that come with the sim require quite a bit more thrust to move and will not continue to roll at idle, coming to a rather quick stop. All of these real-world aircraft have manuals stating that the aircraft can be taxied with idle thrust. Indeed, the 747 can be taxied on just 3 or even 2 engines, depending on the aircraft's gross weight, and most twin-engine jet airline operators around the world taxi their aircraft as much as possible on a single engine to save fuel. What gives? And, by the way, go ahead and start a counter for the number of times the word thrust is said in this video. Thrust, 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 thrust. It's a lot. What's going on is deeper than just add-on aircraft having a higher level of fidelity or realism than the default jets. No, to understand this, we have to take a look deeper under the hood and spoil some of the magic that is Flight Simulator's physics modeling. Let's start with the basics of jet engines in a simulator, such as, Flight Simulator 2004 for no reason. Most of the functionality isn't relevant to us right now. The only part that matters to this discussion is this graph, thrust vector versus CN1. The data to create this graph come from table 1506 of the aerodynamics or .air file for any given jet aircraft in the simulator. Don't worry about what CN1 on the x-axis means. For our purposes today, think of it as the RPM of the engine expressed as a percentage of its maximum, going from 0 to 100%. If you're an aeronautical engineer, pretend you didn't hear that. The y-axis is our thrust factor, which is applied to the thrust rating value in the aircraft's configuration file, referred to as static thrust, because it represents the engine's maximum safe thrust output when sitting stationary, or static. There are multiple curves on the graph for different velocities, but we really only need the line corresponding to 0 velocity, static thrust. To determine the amount of thrust to be fed into the flight dynamics engine for a given RPM of the simulated jet engine, we can go directly to any x-axis point on the graph representing the RPM in question and read its y-axis value, then multiply this by the static thrust in the configuration file. The graph you see now is from my own Boeing 747-200 in Flight Sim 2004, which has a static thrust value of 50,000 pound-force of thrust per engine. If we wanted to determine thrust at 60% RPM, we go to the x-axis value, 60, read the y-axis value, 0.2825, and multiply the values together, giving us 14,125 pound-force of thrust. This is the thrust generated by one of its 4 engines operating at 60% RPM. If all 4 together are operating at 60% RPM, we would have a total thrust of 56,500 pound-force. Using jet engine data tables 1502 and 1503 in the aerodynamics file of the 747, we can calculate that idle thrust on a standard day at sea-level static conditions corresponds to approximately 26% N1, which will produce about 2,000 pound-force of thrust per engine, 8,000 pound-force in total if all 4 engines are running at idle. That's enough thrust to lift my car vertically into the atmosphere. But is it enough to move a fully loaded 747? To determine that, we must now understand what forces will oppose the forward motion of our aircraft. For non-skidding, forward-rolling motion on a level surface at taxiing speeds with no wind, the majority of the force acting against the aircraft is going to be friction against the concrete or asphalt underneath the wheels, as well as friction from within components of the wheels themselves, altogether referred to as rolling resistance. The formula for rolling resistance is Cf times m times g, where m is the mass of the aircraft, g is the gravitational constant, and Cf is the coefficient of friction, a dimensionless number used to correct the mass of the object attempting to be rolled for the amount of rolling resistance it should encounter. The value for Cf depends on the roller as well as the rollee. For well-inflated rubber wheels on concrete or asphalt with negligible resistance from wheel components such as bearings or stuck brakes, a typical value is between 0.01 and 0.02 depending on the condition of the wheels and the surface. Boeing uses a value of 0.014 in their airport design documentation for the Boeing 777, and NASA used a value of 0.015 when creating their own 747-100 simulator way back in 1971. If we go back to our formula, plug in a value of 0.015 for Cf, and plug in values of 377,800 kilograms for a fully loaded 747, and a gravitational constant of 9.81 meters per second squared, if you're a physicist, pretend you didn't hear that, the total force required to move our 747 on a level surface with negligible air resistance is about 55,600 newtons, or 12,500 pound force. Our engines are only producing 8,000 pound force of thrust, so the aircraft will not budge when fully loaded at idle thrust. Now, because you were paying attention to the video that you decided to watch, you probably noticed that one of the three primary factors in our equation is mass, and if the mass decreases, so too does the force required to move our aircraft. We can rearrange our equation to determine the mass at which idle thrust at sea level static conditions would equal the amount of force required to move the aircraft, which gives us 241,800 kilograms, roughly. Below that mass, our aircraft will slowly begin to creep forward with ever-increasing acceleration as mass continues to decrease. Rolling friction has been well understood for hundreds of years, and the formula that we just used to calculate it was first basically described as early as 1781 when Charles-Augustin Coulomb published Théorie des machines simples, en ayant regard flottement de la partie et à la raideur des cordages. When automobiles began using rubber tires over 100 years ago, tests were conducted to determine the rolling resistance of these new wheels so that engines could be adequately sized for the amount of force required to move a given vehicle. The value of Cf for lots of different kinds of wheels and surfaces are known, and have been known for dozens of years at least. A development studio creating a home flight simulator based upon contemporary physics for a company the size of Microsoft would likely have unfettered access to this research and information, so when they created their ground friction model for Flight Simulator, they naturally relied on the classic empirical formulas for rolling resistance that we just used. And given that the vast majority of aircraft in existence have used rubber tires, they tuned the models to use coefficients of friction that correspond to averages for well-maintained tires and pavements. Coefficients like 0.05 for concrete, 0.05 for asphalt, 0.05 for... Hey, wait a second! I know we're working with decimals, so it can be hard to catch, but Microsoft's Flight Simulator, by default, uses a friction coefficient of 0.05 for most types of pavement, as opposed to a more typical value of 0.015. That's more than 3 times a typical friction value. That amount of friction would be similar to having your brake pedal pretty substantially depressed while trying to drive your car normally, at all times. Why? Why have they done this? I don't know! I've racked my brain for an answer to this question for the last decade when I first discovered this discrepancy while trying to answer the question of why do some aircraft taxi at idle thrust just fine in the sim but others don't? The answer, as it turns out, seems dependent upon whether a given developer has tuned their aircraft's thrust graph to account for this unnaturally high ground friction. Indeed, if you look through the thrust graphs of the aircraft mentioned at the beginning, you will immediately notice a stark difference among those that do taxi at idle thrust versus those that don't. This large bump in thrust in the low power range is the answer, and rather unsurprisingly, this bump is about 3 times the amount of thrust normally generated in this range. So, this allows the aircraft to taxi at idle thrust, right? Problem solved! Hooray! Well, boys, we did it. Friction is no more.
Hold it!
Indeed, simply bumping the thrust in the low RPM range has other consequences that a developer must now either live with or overcome. The most immediate one that may come to your mind is a change to the flight characteristics. More thrust at idle would make descent planning in most jet airliners much more challenging or even impossible. Jet airliners are often already described as quite slippery by pilots, the common saying being that you can either slow down or go down, but you can't do both. Adding 3 times the normal thrust at idle might make an aircraft descend so slowly as to be entirely impractical or even make it impossible to descend at a constant indicated airspeed, which is a very common requirement in the modern air traffic control environment. Probably worse than that though, extremely high ground friction is highly detrimental to the takeoff performance of an aircraft and will unrealistically shorten the length of a landing rollout as well. Using the amazing program Advanced Jet Performance Calculator developed by Airways, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, which very handily includes an input for the ground friction coefficient, a heavyweight takeoff roll for my 747 is increased by over 1,000 feet compared to realistic ground friction values, a huge amount of distance that would absolutely need to be accounted for in the planning and performance of an aircraft. Another problem introduced with the brute force solution of increasing thrust at low power settings is that you dramatically increase the fuel consumption calculated by the simulator at idle thrust, which, for reasons too exhausting and frankly too dumb to get into in this video, is tied directly to the net thrust of the engine with no real ability to finally control the fuel flow schedule. Increasing thrust by a factor of 3 increases the fuel consumption proportionally, and given that an aircraft can spend a not insignificant proportion of an hour taxiing all the while consuming 4 figures of fuel mass per hour, tripling this consumption would be absolutely disastrous for fuel planning and for the environment. A workaround for these issues is to simply include another line on the thrust graph representing a very low in-flight Mach number, something like Mach 0.05 or 0.1. This is low enough that it will allow the rest of the thrust graph to cover all feasible in-flight scenarios and therefore fix the descent performance problem while also allowing the aircraft to be taxied at idle thrust. This does next to nothing to solve the fuel consumption problem, but most serious flight sim developers gave up on that system decades ago for good reason anyway, myself included. If you're not insane like me, or simply don't know how to program your own fuel consumption system, sorry, I guess? To this day, I still have not been able to think of an explanation for why this was done. If the intent was to make the sim feel more like a game by making landings easier by taking up less distance, they unnecessarily made takeoffs and taxiing much harder, and this would be better achieved by simply adding a slider or a checkbox to the realism page that multiplies the effectiveness of the brakes by a factor of 2 or something to achieve the desired effect. I read a claim that's old enough to drink now on the AveSim forum that the simulator was fundamentally changed from Flight Simulator 5 onward to no longer include a separate ground dynamics model alongside the flight model. This ground model apparently being active with any of the wheels on the ground and taking over for the flight model in such conditions. When this ground dynamics model was supposedly eliminated, the developers of Flight Sim found that aerodynamic forces would make it nearly impossible to control an aircraft on the ground due to sliding, and so ground friction was made dramatically higher than is realistic as a quick fix. I have no idea if this is actually true, as I don't currently have a PC to run Flight Sim 4 or Flight Sim 5, nor the tools and the time to investigate how the physics models in those versions work anyway. I can confirm that changing the values of ground friction in the sim1.dll file of Flight Simulator 2004, basically hacking the code, has had no noticeable effect on the ability to taxi, take off, or land in even the strongest of crosswind conditions in any aircraft, likely because the ground physics model in Flight Sim accounts for this by having sliding friction forces that act against the tires on the ground proportionally to the amount of weight placed on the wheels, just as one would expect in real life. So, I'm not really so sure about the veracity of that claim, but I also can't verify or deny it outright. Anyway, speaking of modifying the game files, that's exactly what I've done to fix the idle thrust taxi problem. Basically, by using a hex editor, it's possible to go into the primary simulation code file, sim1.dll, locate the values for ground friction, and change them to basically anything you want. You can do this for all 25 surface types listed in the file and verify the change using another of Vodovoz tools, AFSD. Saul has done a ton of work to build tools to assist developers, and you should go support him even if you're not a developer, because chances are his tools and wisdom have likely supported a developer whose products you've used. There was also a Lua script fix that could be used via FSUIPC in Flight Simulator X and I think prepared, but I'm a lot less familiar with that method, so I'll leave its inclusion in this video to just this one sentence mention. Now, obviously, this presents a reverse challenge to anyone who does this fix. Aircraft designed to taxi under idle power by default will now leap the chocks and run away from you without themselves being modified. This is generally a very trivial change to someone like me who does these little modifications all the time for fun and for added realism. You don't even really have to be that scientific about it. Just divide whatever value is at the top of the bump here by about 3, and then smooth out the curve using a tool like Aircraft Airfile Manager, and chances are it'll work pretty good. Now, if you're flying something other than a jet airliner, fixing those taxi dynamics can be a bit more complex. It can be done, and I have done so several times, but I'll leave that as an exercise for the reader using documents published across the internet, such as Yves Guillaume's overview of flight sim flight dynamics. I'm just realizing as I write this how much it seems French people in particular have contributed to my understanding of flight sim's flight dynamics. Thanks guys. This neat paper I found correlating propeller advance ratios with power factors, etc. and so forth. It's advanced, it's technical, and in being so, it presents a solid argument as to why someone would not want to modify their Sim1DLL file for fear of breaking their aircraft in ways they may not know how to fix. That's fine. In fact, this very practice of modifying and working on aspects of the simulator in the name of perfect realism can result in an exhaustive cycle of always working on something rather than just playing and having fun in the sim. And if that's not your thing, then I'd argue don't bother. Most turboprop and propeller aircraft taxi just fine under the basic ground dynamics, and many jet aircraft add-ons have already been adjusted with these limitations of the simulator in mind. And for those that haven't, the simplest workaround is to just use more thrust on the ground. It may be unrealistic, and you may also have to add a few extra 1,000 pounds of fuel for taxi purposes, but it is easy, and for most users, the system works well enough. Obviously, I wish the developers had simply used correct ground friction modeling from the start, but ground friction is by far one of the least important quote-unquote bugs in the simulator in my view. I mean, have you seen how drag and Mach number are handled? Mach number drag being additive to CD0? No way to finely tune drag divergence Mach number? No ability to even define a basic drag curve, and being stuck relying on an induced drag approximation that only works under incompressible flow? No ability to define a basic drag curve despite being able to set lift curve. Thanks for watching. I've been super busy with some real life stuff, some things that were very important. When I made my last video back in December, I made that with the intention that I would be making a video at least once a month from that point forward, because that's what I really wanted to do. That was the New Year's resolution and kind of the goal that I'd made for myself. Obviously, that did not happen, but that's mostly been for reasons out of my control. Anyway, I wanted to come back into making videos with something a bit simpler than a longer scripted thing covering some add-on or a history piece on Flight Sim. And if those are the things you really like, don't worry, I've got plenty more of them planned. There's dozens of add-ons to cover. I just need to more consistently have the time to work on those larger projects. And I'm hoping that that will be very soon. Anyway, if you like what I do, consider subscribing and leaving a like on the video. If you want to support the channel monetarily, you can do so through a custom one-time donation on Ko-Fi, or by subscribing to my Patreon for access to a few exclusive goodies from me. You can also join our Discord server to be a part of a currently small community of like-minded retro flight sim lovers. Anyway, thank you for visiting the museum today, and I hope to see you back here soon.